In this section, we'll look at how life was a bit conformist for many people in the 1950s. Certainly after all the turmoil of the Great Depression and World War II, people were willing to settle down and have things calm for a while. And the entire culture sort of welcomed the prosperity, and they didn't see it as bland, they saw it as restful. The culture, of course, stressed the traditional nuclear family. The father gets up and goes to work and is the provider, and the mother stresses she's the homemaker and raising the baby boom by and large. And you can see this in a lot of different ways. For example, the women's magazine Red Book proclaimed in 1957, quote, "I'm glad I'm just a housewife," unquote. When it came to styles, women preferred snug, tight waistlines, first popularized by the designer Christian Dior in the late 40s. There was a minority of women who liked dresses with no waistline, the so-called sack dresses, but that was definitely a minority. The hair was curled and short, although young girls did like ponytails. The dresses for women flowed, but they were starting to come up because the restrictions on nylon during the war had been lifted, and women felt more comfortable showing their legs with nylon stockings, so the skirt lengths began to go up. You do see rather rigid pointed bras popular, and women in general tried to appear elegant. You see the popular designer Gabrielle Coco Chanel, although she was already in her 70s. When it came to men, they tried to look sophisticated. They generally wore suits, but the double-breasted jackets of the war years had ended. Those who wore jackets tended to like to have a waistline. You do see hats still popular with men, and if they're going to go casual, you see more color and plaids. In some instances, they would wear colorful, almost Hawaiian-themed short-sleeve shirts that they'd leave untucked. Also, you begin to see a casual shirt with a wide collar over a sweater, and so the style was pretty common for the very common for the 1950s. Evangelical religion spread in the 1950s, a very religious period, perhaps because the preachers were all stressing that it was the the antithesis of the atheist communist. But you also see it because of new technologies. You see the beginning of televised preachers, large mass-produced preachers. The best example of this was Billy Graham, who visited the White House in Truman in the 1940s and was still hobnobbing with presidents decades later. Academics soon noted the changing economy produced conformist, prosperous culture. In 1956, William White published his study of a Chicago suburb of Park Forest, and he published the study known as Organization Man. And what he said was, before, when people had to struggle, this promoted a sense of individualism that the culture celebrated. Now, in the 1950s, the beginning of a land of plenty, the emphasis shifted to community and the group. So people were more focused, he argued, in the 1950s on belonging before. They just wanted to find their secure niche in this system because the system seemed to work. Quite a contrast to before. You can see this prosperous conformist 1950s cultures in so many different ways. For example, the first fast food traced its roots to the 1920s with the A&W Root Beer Company and also the White Castle restaurants. With the growth in cars in the 1950s, you're going to see the growth of fast food to go with it. Famously, in 1954, a man named Ray Kroc joined with the two McDonald brothers, who had operated a hamburger stand in California, and then led the company into international behemoth of a franchise hamburger chain known, of course, as McDonald's. With the growth of the interstate system and all the new cars, the cars, by the way, were gas guzzlers, and it was very popular to have fins on the back. Anyway, you're seeing a lot of people take driving vacations, And before, motels, you never really knew what you're going to get. You couldn't really call in advance. You just have to hope for the best. Well, you start seeing mass-produced chain hotels where they were all the same. They all had a swimming pool, and you knew exactly what you could get, and you could book early by phone. Some of the early hotels were Holiday Inns and Howard Johnson's. People would take these car vacations and they'd go to some of the new theme parks that were developing. For example, in California, Anaheim, California, Disneyland opened up in July 1955. The number of visitors to the nation's national parks exploded in the 1950s. Again, a product of these people driving more, and the parks themselves had to expand because of it. The movie industry is going to grow in the 1950s, and it's interesting to know that this is the heyday of the drive-in movie theater. You can still see some of them around, but most of them have died off by now. Of course, both a driver of the booming economy and an example of the standardized conformist culture was the spread of television. At the end of World War II, the U.S. had only 4,000 TV sets, but by the end of the 1950s, there were 40 million TV sets. You're seeing TVs in everybody's houses, and they're all watching the same thing. In 1950, at the beginning of the decade, total revenue for TV was only $2 million. By 1957, total revenue for TV had passed $1 billion. While there were inventions mentioned in another section, all TVs were basically black and white, and they were all watching shows that the networks, the old radio networks, Columbia Broadcasting System, the National Broadcasting Corporation, and American Broadcasting Corporation, CBS, NBC, and ABC, produced. Among the most popular shows were westerns like The Virginian or Gunsmoke, and of course they were following on the movies which have been showing westerns since the Great West. Situation comedies, which became known as sitcoms, were popular. 30-minute comedies like I Love Lucy or Leave It to Beaver. Variety shows were popular with comedians and music. Some of the variety shows were Milton Berle's Show, for example. The first late-night talk show began in 1957, known as The Tonight Show, and its host was Jack Paar. He was later followed by Johnny Carson and still later on by Jay Leno. Crime dramas were popular, just like they are today. For example, Dragnet. All of these shows were dominated by advertisers who were studying who watched them according to their sex and age and income to see what their audience was so they can specifically market their goods. And it was the beginning of the 30-second advertising soundbite that the stations would sell. I should note that at the end of the day, the TV shows would go off, they would play the national anthem, and they'd be off until the next morning. In the 1950s, the Supreme Court ruled that television quiz shows were not gambling, and therefore the number of them quickly exploded. However, there was a bit of a scandal. In the popular quiz show 21, the popular contestant that kept winning, Charles Van Doren, later had to admit that producers had given him the answers when they realized that the audience liked him. TV at first was seen as educational, but by the end of the 1950s, people were wondering if it was part of what appeared a long-term drop in reading and writing skills. I should note that they had the invention of the frozen TV dinner, which was first sold in 1953. I should also note that city water officials noted drops in water pressure during the top show's commercials. Everybody was watching the same show, which is sort of the best example of a conformist culture. This concludes this section on how the economy produced a rather conformist culture in the 1950s.